Hello and welcome to episode 121 of Communicast, the podcast dedicated to enhancing communication skills. I'm your host, Scott D'Amico, president of Communispond. Today I'm joined by Travis Hahler, founder of the Neurological Nomad, strategy and transformation leader at Salesforce, and author of Rethink Resistance. Travis brings together neuroscience, psychology, and business leadership to help organizations better understand how people respond to change and how leaders can communicate more effectively through transformation. In this episode, Travis and I explore why people naturally resist change, how neuroscience influences the way messages are received, and what leaders can do to communicate in ways that build trust instead of triggering fear and uncertainty. Whether you're leading organizational change, managing a team, or simply looking to become a more effective communicator, this conversation offers practical insights you can put to work immediately. Let's dive in. Travis, thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Scott. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Before we get into our conversation, if you could, maybe tell the listeners just a little bit about you, your career journey, and the great work that you're doing today.
Absolutely. So, a little bit about me. I have a company called the Neurological Nomad. We specialize in helping to bring neuroscience and neuropsychology to leaders and helping them to embrace resistance in order to lead that kind of transformational change. And that's kind of my side job. My day job is I lead strategy and transformation for Salesforce and Fortune 500 companies. So it's a little bit about me. My background sits kind of at that intersection of human behavior, business, and neuroscience. And so I help leaders really understand how they can use all of that information together to be great leaders.
Very cool. And I can imagine at an innovative company such as Salesforce, change and transformation probably keeps you quite busy. And as I think about how it seems that as humans, we are hardwired to resist and to fight change. So, what really drew you into that line of work?
Yeah, it was an interesting journey. I think you probably most folks you talk to probably say that exact same thing. But for me, I started my journey in education around psychology, really thinking about I loved people, I loved how they operated, and that evolved into neuroscience and really understanding what was happening in the brain. And then really kind of stopped there for a while. And I was like, I don't really know what I want to do with that. I know I love people. I know I want to help people. I know I want to understand them better and help them understand themselves better. But I didn't know what I wanted to do with it in a practical sense. And as most people being young, we think of things very, black and white. And so I was like, well, that's one lane. I'll go a different lane. So I went and got an MBA and went into the quote unquote business world. As I was in that space, consulting and helping companies to transform, the thing that kept coming back for me was this background in human behavior and neuroscience. And it kept coming back in the way that I was conversing with people and the way that I was communicating with leaders, the way that I was communicating with people that were being impacted by change. And really, what started to evolve for me was it became a differentiator. The reason I was in the room with the executives was because I was able to articulate to them in a human way what was really happening to them, what was really happening to their people. And they were responding to that. And so that kind of evolved into this idea that neuroscience and understanding human behavior was really essential to drive true transformational change and to make it stick and to be a great leader. And so I went back and did research on that thesis and came out with a theory of six neurological barriers that stop us from being able to change as humans and naturally stop us and what you can do about it. And that kind of snowballed into the Neurological Nomad, which snowballed into now a book, and that's kind of what drew me into this space was really that coming together of how people actually operate and go through change, and then that added layer of what leaders can actually do to embrace some of that to be great leaders. Because I saw really great leaders weren't just people who had good vision. They were people that truly thought about their teams and their people and what they were going to go through and planned for that.
Oh, what a cool journey. And one of the things you mentioned there that jumped out to me was you're able to, I believe, articulate things in a human way, right? So people can understand that, whether it is technical data, complex systems, abstract thoughts and concepts, being able to get that in a way that people understand, for me, is a hallmark of a great communicator. And one of the things I always love hearing from the guests is, when they hear that phrase that somebody is a great communicator, what does that mean to you, or what's the vision that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, and maybe mine's a little different than some, but for me, a great communicator is not just someone who speaks clearly. It's really someone who understands how their message is being received. So it's more than just sharing it. It's actually understanding how people will take it in and understand it. And, a lot of leaders ask you, did I explain it clearly, or was that clear? And while that's useful, it's really the better question is, how did it land in the brain, in the body, in the person receiving it? What are they doing with that? Did I just, create excitement and motivation, or did I just activate their threat response and fear and do the things I wasn't intending to do? Because during change, people can understand messages in many different ways, and oftentimes we're looking for not reasons to resist, but our brains are looking for reasons to keep us safe. And so anything that seems threatening can be really a hindrance to that kind of ability to clearly communicate and then also communicate action and what that means for someone.
I think people too often treat their communication like a grenade. They pull the pin, they throw it over the wall, and just hope for the best. They really don't pay attention to the impact that their communication had. And as you mentioned, it's really about how it is received. A past guest said something that has stuck with me. It's that 100% of what is said by the listener, right? So that it doesn't matter the words that come out of my mouth. Ultimately, what matters is what they heard, in essence, what they said in their own brain once they process that. And if you're not thinking about that, checking in on that, looking for signals as to what's going on when you're communicating, your initiatives, I think, and your communications are going to miss the mark.
Absolutely. And I think, someone said to me early in my career, perception is reality. It doesn't actually matter what your intention was. It matters how it was perceived by someone else. And that's what creates kind of the experience that happens, exactly like you just said. And the way that I've talked to leaders about it, especially communication in itself, is you're not transmission, you're translation. So how are you not just sharing out something, you're translating something from what it is that needs to be said to making sure that what that is gets actually translated to what someone will understand at the end of it. So it's about translation, not just transmission. Because a lot of leaders will say, well, we sent the email, we did that, we did the town hall, we did that. And it's a check the box activity in most cases. But communication is not a check the box activity.
Definitely not. And that transitions very nicely into what I was wanting to talk about next. If we think about the workplace today and successful communication in the workplace, what ultimately goes into that, and what are some of the skills and strategies that do help people to communicate successfully, to grow, and as you mentioned, kind of to get into the room with the executives, right? Be in the room when it happened, to be able to do that. And one of the sections of your book, I think, hit on this very nicely, especially with this idea of it's not transmission, it's translation, of taking, like, say, a campaign style approach to your communications. You could talk a little bit about what's a successful communication in the workplace look like today?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to communicate successfully in the workplace. I'll pull from kind of the way that I've talked to leaders about communication, especially those who aren't naturally in communicating roles. And now all leaders are communicators, but don't maybe have the background of communications as their kind of bread and butter. I talked to them in kind of the four quadrants of what a good communication should be. There's the first quadrant is really the why are we doing it? The second quadrant being the positive benefits of what it's going to bring us. And that is where I find most leaders stop. They're like, great, thank you so much. I've got it. And I'm like, hold on. Remember, four. We just got through two. But that's where a lot of people stop. And I think what that creates is that almost the used car salesman kind of pitch, which is I'm going to tell you why you need it and I'm going to tell you how great it is. I'm going to ignore all the other stuff, but I'm going to really sell you on it. And people inherently understand when they're being sold. And it automatically creates divide and mistrust of what's being told to them. So that's the first two. When you get to the third, it's really here are the things that aren't going to go well. Here are the things that you're not going to love, right? It's things like, you know what? The system is amazing. It's going to do all this stuff, or AI seems to be the example that we're all using today. So let's use that. AI is amazing. It brings all these things. Here are the things that are realities that might not be the greatest, right? AI could replace certain roles that we're playing today. It could change the way that we're working. We could find something it can do that we don't need to do anymore. And that's a reality of AI. And then the last quadrant is really around what's not changing that people value. So what's not changing, and at companies, you talked about kind of a campaign style. It's things like anchoring back to what the company is doing. It's, you know what, it doesn't change the fact that we are people centric. It doesn't change the fact that we, lead with empathy. It doesn't change our expectation of how we work in this organization and the way that we do X, Y, Z. And so making sure you have all four quadrants, that is a well-rounded communication that goes to your people in an organization, especially large organizations, and ensuring that you're doing kind of the whole gamut of everything that someone would need to know in that communication.
My dad sold cars for 30 plus years. So I love the analogy of the used car salesman because he sold
So did
used
mine.
cars. And really?
Yes.
So, so if you think about it, right? Anyone that's listening to this, if you've bought a car anytime in the recent distant past, typically when you step foot onto a car lot, you're on guard, right? Because of the stereotypes, the perceptions of that process. I think it's very similar at work. When you are rolling out a new initiative on work at work, people's gut reaction is to resist. They're going to be on edge. So if you're only telling them all the good stuff, I think that hurts your credibility a little bit. Some people might just buy into it hook, line, and sinker, but a lot of people I think are going to be, well, I feel like I'm not getting the whole picture here. But if you start to say, okay, here are some of the things we need to be aware of, right? Here are some of the potential pitfalls that we're going to run into. Then you round it out with, as you mentioned, here's what's not changing, right? These couple things are changing, but here's all the things that are staying the same, tying it into the why and how it's going to benefit you. As you mentioned, you get the full picture, really is going to help people buy into what you're doing.
Absolutely. It's so important. And like you said, that it's such a great analogy, actually, as you played it out, that way that you're kind of on guard, you're kind of looking out for the salesman coming out onto the lot, and kind of preparing yourself when you see them. It is an interesting way that we kind of do react in those moments. And it's the same in our companies too.
Travis, as you think about your career and the journey you've been on, the success that you've had, and you hit it on a little bit earlier with you were in the room with the leaders. What's kind of the key skill that really helped you to get there, right? To have people trust what you were doing, or maybe it's some of those skills that tie into being able to communicate things in that human way. What's kind of the key skill that's really stood out for you?
I think it's kind of a two-part for me. If that's an acceptable answer, Scott. The two parts for me are, one, I'm really good at simplifying very complex things. And I think that anyone who's really good at communicating, that's what they do. And that comes back to that translation part. Like, you really do need to translate something that is usually really, really complicated into something very easy to understand that people can absorb. Oftentimes we go with the several page memo that talks about all the intricacies. Most people don't need to know all of that. I mean, it's great to have it, it's great to share it, but it's not what you need in your key message. So that was one, making it very, very simple and very easy to understand. And then the second part of that was, and I do talk about this in the book a lot, is empathy. I think empathy is so critical as you're thinking about what people will experience as they go through reading this communication or hearing this information. And if you can lead with that empathy, you've already kind of found the gotchas and the questions and the things that you can predict that are going to come, which then help you create a better a way of communicating that information because you're already coming to it answering the bulk of the initial like kind of gut reaction questions that people are going to have. So I think empathy is really critical in being, a successful communicator and making sure that you're communicating well.
And when you hit on empathy there, I like how you tied it into this concept of anticipating things. So that's one of the things that we teach a lot is when you're presenting and communicating, you want to anticipate the audience's reaction. What are some of the things that they may push back on? What are some of the things that they may like? And I never really thought through the lens of that's empathy, right? When you're trying to, put yourself in someone else's position and understand how they could be feeling. So fantastic. I love that. And then the other thing around simplification, when I hear simplification in communication, my mind goes to stories, and analogies, similar to how we just talked about the car dealership and the car salesperson. As you can take complex ideas, complex data, information, and really step back and think about how can I convey this in a story, whether it is something personal that's happened in my life where I can make that connection, or even very literally, walking through a story of when it happened in a past career, a past
Mhm.
employer. Using stories is a foundational, transformational way to simplify your information and to help people understand it.
And we're naturally storytellers as a species. I mean, we just that's how we've communicated for centuries, right? And it works because you're able it kind of ties the two things together, right? You can feel empathy through stories even without having known anything about the story before it happened, right? You read a story and you can almost put yourself in those shoes just through the fact that you're understanding the story and how it's working. So I think they tie so nicely together, that ability to tell stories and be empathetic. And sometimes just playing that out for yourself too. Doesn't
Mm-hmm.
always mean that the story has to go beyond yourself. Sometimes telling yourself the story of what is going to happen here? Let me lay it out for myself in terms of here's the story that's going to go on. And then if I were to wind back the clock and say, before I started that story, what were things that the story revealed for me that I should have come to it with? To your point, and then predicting that and saying, oh, yeah, the things I was thinking about as I was going through that were XYZ. That's how I can help make this better.
Love it. No, that's a great framework to work through as you're going through this process at work, and you have maybe a big presentation or meeting coming up. Step back, think through it through the lens of a story. Whether you use that specific story in the meeting or not, as you mentioned, can help you preempt some of the things that you might run into and reframe how you position that in the meeting.
Absolutely.
Travis, who's someone from throughout your life or your career that has, had an impact on your communication style or the way that you communicate? Maybe it's something that you had a mentor or family member where you just picked up on something that they did, you tweaked it, made it your own a little bit.
I have been fortunate enough in my life, and I think my family, um, we love to tell stories. And it's something where I can vividly remember sitting down with my grandparents and them talking about their lives and, previous experiences. Well, the reason for this is because then they go into this story from, the 30s or the 40s or whatever time frame it was. But they were really interesting storytellers. And I remember listening to my grandparents a lot and listening to their stories and how much it kind of captivated me. And I think that's where I started speaking in stories actually quite often. I do it at work all the time. I always have a story for something that's like, oh, so what you're saying is it's like X or whatever that looks like. But for me, it really started probably in childhood of hearing just my family talk about our family and talk about their experiences and kind of how things came to be as they are today. And I think that has shown me that there's something extremely engaging there. And I think my grandmother was a wonderful storyteller. And so, the way that she was able to be very captivating, I think about that a lot in the way that I'm telling stories and the way that I'm articulating vision to people.
No, I love hearing that. That's so cool when you can tie the family aspect into, and I think that might be the first grandma that got a shout out for the influence. That's always great to hear. You know, for me, when it comes down to stories, and we see this a lot with the coaching and the training that we do, is I think a lot of people are intimidated by stories. And when I really peel it back, it's that most folks just aren't taking the time to think through it. I'm willing to challenge anyone listening out there. If you have something coming up at work, if you took honestly even 5, 10 minutes just to start to think back, okay, what's going on here? And has there been something throughout my life, whether it is, I guess it happened to me, was part of a different job that I did. Even I'm a big movie and sports person trying to find a tie in to whether it's a movie or a show that I watch or a character or even things that you learn through sport. You're more often than not, you're going to find something where you can make that tie in to help people really connect. And as we talked about, it helps to translate that message rather than just transmit it. Travis, as we're wrapping up here, two questions for you. Take them any order that you want. First is if folks want to get in touch with you just to learn more about your work and your book, the best way to do that, and I'll make sure I put it down in the show notes. And then you just closing advice for people listening to this around either actions they should take or the importance of the skills that we talked about today.
Yeah, best way to get in touch with me is either through my website or through LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me. I love speaking with people about these really complex problems that we're trying to solve in the business world and our corporate lives. And so please feel free to reach out in any capacity. But for me, as I'm thinking about kind of your second part of your question, it's really what it comes down to for me is a lot of how we think about the way that people are truly taking in the messages. And we've talked a lot about that in this conversation, Scott, but it goes a little deeper. And I think this is kind of the tie-in to my book, Rethink Resistance, which is y- what we're doing in those moments and when we're communicating, and oftentimes the way that we communicate, especially when it comes to change, is typically met with some level of resistance, hesitation. And the thing that I talk to a lot of leaders about, and I think this is really important for communicators especially, is that there's a separation that needs to happen between the ego side of our work and the reality of what's actually happening. And the reality of what's actually happening when we're communicating these big changes and big ideas is that we are setting off that threat response within our people. And that is a natural, evolved thing. Our brain's entire job is essentially to keep us alive, right? So it's whether we're threatened, whether we need something, whatever that is. A lot of people mistake that to be character or some form of attack on their leadership or on their ability. They are very separate things. And so I think if I could leave the folks, listening to this with anything, it is that resistance is not a reflection on whether or not your people are bought in, they believe you, they're behind you in the mission, the vision, whatever it is that you're communicating. It really is telling you exactly what's happening within their own brains and how they're reacting to what they're hearing. And I think it's not necessarily bringing about the best communication of the change, because we like to wordsmith it to try to make it just as much of a rah-rah as we can, but it's really more about how we bring that information and then we bring our backpack full of support, which is, I understand this is probably landing in a certain way. You might be anxious about it. It might mean something to you that's different than the way we're intending it. Here's what we can promise you through this journey. We're going to help do XYZ. We're going to be communicating with you the whole way. We've got ways for you to get in touch with us. It's coming with the support as well as the message. And I think that's the biggest thing that I would leave the folks with here is that message.
That's great. So I pick up, right? You want to be transparent. You want to be empathetic with your approach. You want to be clear with your communications. And then ultimately, you want to hit those four quadrants, right? Why are we doing it? What's going to be good for you? What are some potential downfalls, risks, whatever it may be? and then what's not changing. I think if you check all those boxes, it's really going to help. And then, understanding that people typically are going to come to the table with some resistance just naturally. It's going to be there. So being aware that people are naturally going to resist, it's not necessarily a reflection of you or what you're doing. It's the way that we are wired. And then the other thing that I would leave the listeners with is that oftentimes when we hear about change at work, it's usually some big, massive transformation. We're moving CRM, right? So that just freaks salespeople out, or we're completely pivoting our strategy from B2B to B2C. But these could be small things of, I come out of a sales background. So working with the sales rep that maybe their approach to prospecting or their approach to meetings isn't working. So how do we change that approach? It could be something very small as a coaching moment, but still kind of working it through that lens is very important, because not all change is this massive, massive undertaking.
Yeah, and especially when you talk about groups like sales organizations. So wonderfully said, Scott.
Travis, thank you so much for joining me. Thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Scott. I appreciate it. And thank you for inviting me on the podcast.
My pleasure. Special thanks again to Travis Hahler for joining me and sharing his insights on neuroscience, leadership, and communication during change. One of the biggest takeaways from this conversation is that communication isn't simply about sending a message. It's about understanding how that message is received. Great communicators don't just focus on what they say, they think carefully about what their audience is experiencing, feeling, and processing in the moment. Be sure to subscribe to Communicast so you don't miss future episodes featuring communication experts, business leaders, and coaches sharing practical strategies to help you communicate with greater confidence and impact. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating or review. It helps more people discover the show and supports our growing community. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.